Two of the greatest fears that human beings often have is number one, the loss of physical ability, but also the loss of dignity. Persons diagnosed with dementia are at tremendous risk for loss of dignity. Let's look at some reasons why this might happen. First off, communication problems. As the dementias advance, people often lose the ability to communicate effectively. For some, it's difficulty in finding the right words to use. For others, even loss of ability to form words and use sentences appropriately. Memory loss is another reason for loss of dignity. As someone loses the ability to remember recent occurrences, things that have just happened, or they lose the ability to remember upcoming appointments or things that they should keep track of, this definitely affects their feelings of self-worth and ultimately their dignity. When a person with dementia gradually loses the ability for self-care, this is a tremendous assault on their personhood. You can imagine not having the ability to pull your pants down independently to use the toilet, to not have the ability to cleanse yourself appropriately after toileting, to not have the ability to bathe independently or to put your clothes on without reminding, prompting, or even performance of the task. Residents may also have their dignity assaulted simply because they're older. Our Anglo-American culture, frankly, does not revere elders the way some other cultures do. As people age, they are not often viewed as contributing members of our society, but rather simply sometimes bodies that just take up space or use up precious resources. Behaviors also come into play. The person may develop what others perceive as childish or childlike behaviors. In fact, however, treating this individual in a childlike manner is one of the worst possible things we can do. Other behaviors also need to be considered as well, as a person with dementia may have a problem with catastrophic reactions, or yelling, or easy loss of emotion. This definitely can affect how others perceive them. The fact of the matter is, we need to look at what happens when a resident senses a loss of dignity or self-worth. First off, they can begin to isolate. Rather than want to socialize with others as they once did, they start isolating. They don't want to go out of their room. They don't want to participate in activities they once enjoyed because they feel somehow perhaps they're not keeping up with others. They feel maybe out of place. The resident living in your assisted living community has already experienced a number of losses. Perhaps they have lost a spouse, they have given up their home, perhaps driving privileges, their professional life, perhaps even some of the sports or other activities of leisure that they once enjoyed. And if they feel that they are also losing their sense of dignity, this can definitely put them at risk for depression. You may find depression to take place especially with residents newly diagnosed with dementia. We may actually also see an increase in dependence. When the resident realizes they're having difficulty perhaps getting that shirt on in the morning, they just give up and just say, forget it, I can't dress myself at all, and expect us to completely dress and take care of them. Now, negative behaviors can result as well because this resident is not feeling good about themselves. And so this gets projected to others, including you, the caregiver. So it's important as professional caregivers that we really examine what can we do to protect the dignity of our residents? What can we do to promote self-worth? What can we do to help promote a sense of normalization with our resident care?
People have to realize that not everybody is the same. Just because they're elderly it wouldn't be proper to disrespect them and not take into consideration the things that they live through in life, and that they're individuals, they have their own way of doing things and things they prefer their way, and it's not that hard to give them their own preferences instead of making it a ritual or just everybody's got to do the same thing. Just taking the time to be on their level.
Protecting resident dignity is a part of everyday life within our community, but something we want to pay particular attention to when a resident has been diagnosed newly with dementia, as well as the person with advancing dementias. We're going to begin with the important concept that we know our resident. We know their names, we pronounce their names appropriately, we know the name they like to be called within our community. Something as simple as calling the resident by their appropriate name really is a very important part of maintaining their dignity. We want to see each resident as the individual that they are. It's also important that you develop a genuine sense of respect for your resident. Of course, we respect all of our residents because we're in charge of their care. We are responsible to our residents. But what I would like to ask you is to look at each one of your residents and develop a genuine respect and honor for them as individuals. What have they accomplished in their lives that you particularly admire? What about them right now do you particularly enjoy and respect? You know, sometimes we have residents even with very advanced dementias that maintain a fabulous sense of humor. You can come to work in a rotten mood, sit down with a guy for 5 minutes, and you're already feeling better. So we want to develop a genuine sense of honor and respect for our residents so that we are serving them in a genuine, dignified manner. I'd like to do an exercise right now. I want to ask you to think of a resident that you care for that is diagnosed with dementia. Got a picture of them in your mind? Thinking of their name? Okay, now I'd like to ask you to turn to the person sitting next to you watching this video. I want you to tell the person sitting next to you the name of this resident and something that you particularly admire about them. Okay, we're going to pause the video for just one moment while you do this. Did you have fun talking with each other about your residents? It's important that we look at our residents as individual human beings. Here are things you will definitely want to know about your resident. Where were they born? Where did they grow up? What kind of leisure activities did they enjoy? Did they work outside of the home? If so, what was their profession? How long did they work? Where did they work? Are there any particular accomplishments in their life that they're proud of? What about family? Do they have children? What about brothers and sisters? How about pets? Did they have pets in their lifetime that they particularly enjoyed? What were those pets' names? These are all things that help make this resident who they are today. As you work with your residents, I would like you to think about promoting success. Look for every opportunity for the resident to feel successful. One community had a resident fold socks every single morning. Every single morning they brought the big box of socks out and the resident would sit and match and fold each sock. There were adult-sized socks, there were little tiny baby socks, and the resident would sit and fold each sock. An outsider commented about this and said, you know, isn't that kind of a boring activity? Every single day you have this lady sitting there folding the same box of socks. Actually, no, it wasn't a boring activity. It wasn't a useless activity. It was a fabulous opportunity for that resident to feel successful about herself. Number one, it was a task that she still remembered how to do very well. Secondly, it gave her a sense of accomplishment. She got that whole big box of socks all folded. It made her feel good about herself. So after breakfast, she'd take care of the laundry, as she called it, folding all the socks and neatly stacking them in piles, and then she was ready to go on to another activity in the community, already having a good sense of self-esteem, feeling good about herself.
Presenting opportunities for our residents to participate in any kind of activity should always be failure-free. In other words, you should also have the knowledge that the resident will succeed at the task at hand. For instance, if it's an exercise program, it may be something very simple by just lifting their leg a few times or outstretching their arm a few times. If you know the resident can successfully achieve that task, that's something you'd want to encourage.
In the morning, when it's time to tidy up the resident's room, don't just jump in and start making the bed and cleaning off the dresser and gathering up the soiled towels and so forth. Think about, what can my resident do to participate with this?
Whether a planned activity is physical or emotional or even specific for sensory stimulation, it always provides the residents opportunity for building their self-esteem. Their connection to each other, to other residents, to the staff, and sometimes even families being involved in programming is one way that can develop for the resident an increased feeling of self-worthiness.
Be cautious as residents are participating in everyday life about the community, that you don't demean them by jumping in too soon. If a resident struggles momentarily, that's okay, because they might still be able to do the activity. Now, we're not going to push them to the point of frustration, no, but allow them a moment or two to try and complete the activity successfully before you reach your hand in there to provide assistance.
Well, if they talk too fast to her, it's like she can't comprehend. It takes her longer to process stuff. So if they slow down for her and give her a chance to talk, it's much easier on her, and she will communicate. But if you push and go too fast, she just kind of shuts down.
We've just talked about the fact that it's important to promote success with our residents. It's also important that we as caregivers think of ways that we can help our residents have a sense of accomplishment. Think about this generation that we're caring for. For this generation, there was a very strong work ethic. There was a very strong sense of self-worth in the ability to not only care for themselves, but be good contributors to society. I'd like to ask you right now to think about where you're working today. What could you do with your residents within your own community to help them have a sense of accomplishment, to feel as though they really got the job done with an activity? We're going to pause the video for a moment or two for you to jot some ideas down. Did you come up with some good ideas? Here are some that I had. How about allowing a resident to dry dishes that are safe for them to handle? Sweeping the patio or sweeping the floor. Helping fold laundry. Watering some plants outdoors. Wiping down the tables after a meal. Having the residents help participate in food preparation, whether it's snapping peas or perhaps ladling cookie dough out onto a cookie sheet. If your resident is still capable of reading, they can read a story or read a short poem to other residents even. If you have a community pet, giving water or food to the dog, brushing the dog or brushing the cat also promotes a sense of accomplishment. Remember to thank your residents. Remember to point out when they have successfully accomplished something. Even when accomplishments perhaps don't achieve the standards that you and I might hold for ourselves for that task, we can still help the resident feel what they've done. Perhaps the area with the greatest vulnerability for an assault on residents' dignity is during the provision of personal care. But you know, there's a lot that you and I can do when providing personal care to maintain the residents' dignity. First and foremost, let's allow as much choice as possible. Now, for some residents, making them choose a time of day for a bath and that is overwhelming. But we can still offer little choices to the resident. Whenever performing personal care, privacy is a very significant issue. When residents share a room, it's critically important that we are monitoring for privacy. You can have one resident step outside of the room while you're performing personal care, or remove the resident to a bathroom or other area when providing personal care. Make sure the resident is covered at all times. Frankly, it's easier to remove all their clothing and then simply get rid of those dirty clothes and put on all clean clothes, but that is not normally how you and I would dress, and that's probably not the way the resident would like to be dressed as well. So we want to make sure that we have all of the clean clothing in that stacked at hand, ready for us to put on the resident or ready to assist the resident to dress, so that we are maintaining privacy. Again, allow the resident to do as much self-care as possible. Maybe you need to fold the washcloth on their hand and load the soap onto it, but the resident still has the ability to clean themselves. Allowing them to have the confidence that comes from performing your own self-care is a real gift we can give our residents. When a resident is unsuccessful in performing an activity of daily living or caring for themselves, don't make a big deal out of it. Oh, I'll do it. No. Those type of phrases are very demeaning. Simply quietly and without a big deal, just assist the resident with whatever help they'll need. Make it as normal as possible. Where we actually perform personal care is a foundation for the protection of dignity. There's a common time-saving technique that you will see in assisted living communities from time to time, and that is when a resident awakens in the morning, to escort them to the toilet, pull their pajama bottoms down, and assist them onto the toilet. Then while the resident is voiding, we take off the pajama bottoms, we take off the top, we remove any socks, etc., and we begin dressing them right there while they are still seated on the toilet. Now, admittedly, this is efficient from a time-saving perspective, but is it an assault on the resident's dignity? I think so. Think for just a moment. How would you feel having to urinate while someone is dressing you? I don't think any of us would like that very much. So be considerate. Although it's important to be efficient as caregivers, we never want our efficiency to become an assault on a resident's dignity. We never want to exacerbate behaviors. And let's be honest, during the provision of personal care is often when we may see negative behaviors. If a resident is simply not ready to get dressed, not in the mood for a bath, we want to be cognizant of their desires. It may be better to just walk away, allow the resident to do their own thing, and return 15-20 minutes later and see if they're ready for the shower then. Now, I'm aware some residents are never ready for a shower, and it's always going to be a coaxing contest to encourage them to shower appropriately. But always be willing to compromise. Be willing to work with the resident so that we don't assault their dignity by actually causing negative behaviors simply because we're being too forceful. We want to make sure we're maintaining dignity whenever our resident is out and about in common areas of the facility. One way we'll definitely do this is making sure the resident is well groomed and they have appropriate clothing on. A resident can be mistreated by others if they're exiting their room in their nightie and not appropriately dressed for the dining room. Making sure that their incontinent briefs are changed and they smell good and look good is very important. If you know in the dining room a resident may have problems with consuming food, set the dining room up for success. For example, is it better that the food come out of the kitchen already cut up and ready to eat so the resident doesn't have to manipulate a lot of utensils because they have trouble doing so? For some residents, it's easier to serve them one food at a time, or else they just spend the entire meal time stirring and mixing and they never do get around to eating appropriately. Maintain dignity by making sure the resident has appropriate table mates. Table mates that enjoy being with him. Table mates that enjoy his company. Table mates that will not be overly critical of the way the resident eats, particularly if the resident has food consumption problems. Directing the resident towards appropriate activities. Help the resident maintain their social skills by demonstrating good social skills yourself. If you see a resident wandering off doing something inappropriately, gently redirect them back to the activity that's taking place within the community at that time.
Redirection is the act of engaging a resident toward another activity or something of interest. You can redirect a resident with things that you know are familiar and likable by them. Maybe it's food and ice cream can be offered. Maybe it's looking at something that brings them calmness and comfort, like old photos or a memory book. Other ways of redirecting a resident is simply by walking with them and talking about something reminiscent that they may enjoy to hear.
We want our residents to feel good when they go on outings, especially if they're going somewhere with their family or family is coming to visit. There's several things we can do to help the resident feel good about himself, but also help the families maintain their sense of dignity towards their loved one. First off, educate family members. Not everyone understands dementia. Not everyone understands the behaviors associated with dementia.
We have to remember that sometimes families do not understand the disease process, and it's always best to educate them. Show them how your approach is and how you are redirecting your residents and how their loved one will remain safe.
If you notice family members are interacting inappropriately with your resident, talk to your supervisor to arrange for an educational session. Let your supervisor talk about better ways of communicating with their loved one. Suggest activities that the resident can be successful and the family can enjoy at the same time. Make sure if your resident is going out with the family that they look good. Make sure the resident is wearing clean clothing, they've got appropriate shoes they can walk easily in. Be sure to have the family members take along any assistive devices that the resident might need. If they need a wheelchair for very long walks, make sure it's ready to go so that the resident feels they can spend the day with their family, enjoying a variety of activities, and they've got all the supportive devices that they might need. Let's talk about some of the communication errors that we might make as caregivers that could affect our residents' dignity. The first is never talk about a resident in front of them as though they're not even there. Include them in the conversation. If it's something that you feel the resident shouldn't be included in, then wait and go to a private area to discuss the matter. Oftentimes, family members and other visitors may talk about a resident in the third person. Have you ever walked up to a group of people to find one or two or more people talking about you? Do you remember how uncomfortable you felt? That's just the way our residents can feel when we are talking about them. Even though they might not have the verbal skills to express how they feel, they may have that sense of being uncomfortable. Do not speak to your resident using childlike words or a childlike tone of voice.
We had one that was a real problem, that she would talk to mom in baby tones and just treat her like she was an adult. Mom really resented that, you could tell. Mom still wanted to have her own identity and be her, not some little kid that's being told what to do or kind of pushed around or led. Mom still wanted to feel independent, even though she really couldn't be independent. But you could tell that she wanted to be represented as an adult, treated like everybody else.
Do not speak to your resident in a demeaning way, pointing your finger, etc. Do not raise your voice or speak with a disrespectful tone to your resident. Do not speak in a language your resident cannot understand in front of them. Do not whisper in front of your resident. It's always helpful to smile and look pleasant in front of your resident. Nod, giving them signals of approval, signals of self-worth. Give positive feedback to your resident whenever possible.
Mom was in the facility for a while, and then she kind of struck up interest with this one older gentleman, and I didn't feel real good about it at first. It was very strange. Mom had been a widow a long time, and it was hard to not think of her with Dad, not with a strange man, and it really upset me. So I went and talked to the staff, and they talked to me for quite a while about it, and made me balance myself and my thinking that Mom really did need her own friends, and it was okay for her to have friends, even though it's a male friend, that she needs companionship too. And considering she's having her own life there without me and, you know, being there all the time, she really did need her own companionship. But it was hard to deal with at first.
One part of dignity that is often overlooked in the elder population is dealing with the residents' sexuality needs. We must understand that there's not a magic switch that gets turned at a particular age that turns off the sexuality needs your resident may have. You don't automatically hit 75 and become an asexual creature. So identifying the fact that your residents will have sexual needs is a beginning foundation of assisting them appropriately.
The need to express affection or receive affection does not stop just because a resident is diagnosed with dementia. There are healthy ways a caregiver can interact with a resident which will provide them the stimulation they need to feel loved and wanted, and also to feel that they belong to that community.
Your resident has the right to choose relationships. Your resident has the right to express their sexuality. Now, consent is always a major concern when we are caring for persons with dementia. While residents have the right to form relationships and form bonds and friendships, we always want to make sure that when discussing sexuality that we are dealing with two consenting individuals. There are now methods of evaluating the ability to give consent. So consult with your supervisor if you are concerned whether or not a relationship is truly consensual. If you see a resident thwarting off attention from another individual, if you see a resident doing any physical gestures, or if you see a resident giving any signs that they are not willingly and voluntarily participating in a relationship, you absolutely want to notify your supervisor immediately so that corrective action can take place. Follow your facility protocol at all times. When caring for persons with dementia and dealing with sexuality, behavior issues are a concern. Let's discuss the three main types of behaviors we are concerned about. The first one is inappropriate sexual advances to caregivers. Perhaps this has happened to you, that a resident has said something inappropriate, or perhaps even attempted to touch you in an inappropriate manner. There are several causes for this. One has to do with identity confusion. Sometimes residents are not always sure who a person is.
Residents will frequently misinterpret the role of the person caring for them. A caregiver may be mistakenly thought of as their wife or their husband. It's always good to remind them who you are and what you're trying to do when providing personal care.
Unmet need can also be a causative factor. Confusion over the role of the individual providing care. This is especially true with our male residents. Think for just a moment about the gentleman we care for. Very often, the person that has provided care to them throughout their adult life has often been their sexual partner as well. As an elderly gentleman ages and is unable to perform self-care, who very often performs that care? His wife. So it is easy for someone with dementia to associate caregiving with the same person that they have intimate relations with. So oftentimes there can be areas of confusion for the resident. Something positive you can do is when you're going to provide personal care, number one, watch your body position. Never stand directly in front of a resident where they can easily reach up and grab. Stand off to the side or slightly in back of the resident when, for example, bathing the resident. So rather than bathing them right in front, I will stand off to the back to the side and reach over their chest this way to bathe the front of them. Remind the resident who you are and what your role is. When you first come up to the resident, identify yourself. Good morning, Mr. Smith. It's Sandy. I'm your caregiver today, and I'm going to help with your bath. Sometimes timing personal care appropriately can also help us avoid unwanted sexual advances. Very often, it's easier to bathe a resident that may be prone to sexual advances or provide intimate personal care during the midday rather than evening hours when it's already dark outside. Sometimes the darkness, the evening time can actually prompt those type of behaviors. Let's talk about inappropriate actions towards other residents. If a resident is speaking inappropriately to another resident or giving unwanted advances, simply distract the resident to another activity. Remove them away from that resident and find another pleasurable activity for them to participate in.
If a resident's interaction with a caregiver or another resident becomes inappropriate, it's always best to handle quietly and as privately as possible. Direct the resident to another area or another activity.
Sometimes residents may display inappropriate sexual activity in common areas. If they are involved in a consenting relationship with another resident, you may simply encourage them, escort them to a private area, one of the resident rooms, for example. If a resident is masturbating publicly, never scold or yell at them or demean them in any way. Simply ask the resident to come with you and encourage them to go into their private room. Honor your resident by maintaining appropriate confidentiality. We definitely do not treat a resident in a dignified manner if we are sharing things with others that should be held in confidence. This is particularly true related